Hello, and on this episode of Wherever I Lay My Hat, we have Shebana Coelho, a writer, performance artist, and traveller born in India. Her journey began when she left New York City in 2006 after feeling done with city life and went to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina and from there to Bolivia, Peru, and Mexico. Before she embarked on the big adventure of Mongolia, where she spent a year and a half on a Fulbright research grant to record the sounds and stories of nomadic communities. She wrote about that experience in her essay that was later selected to the best women's travel writing, and I will make sure I include a link to that writing in our show notes. And she now resides in New Mexico, near the indigenous community of the Zuni, where she facilitates a creative writing class called Imagine Fantastic Futures. I'm really excited to have you as a guest, Shebana, and I'd love to hear more about your journey and kind of how you ended up in all of those places and where you are now. So if you wouldn't mind taking us through that, I'd love that.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me on. I love the title too of your. It resonates of your podcast about laying your wherever I lay my hat.
Very, very shamelessly borrowed from a Paul Young song. Wherever I
Yeah.
lay my hat. So it's a Paul Young song, and I love the song, and it resonates for me. So I'd love to say I came up with the name, but very much borrowed.
Well, it is really a lovely image. It pulls to mind of journey and wandering and going where and wherever and making home wherever you are. I a long time ago, someone I can't remember. This is a quote by a monk that someone quoted to me about like these different about your level of comfort wherever you are that shows you how you can integrate something like you know I can't remember it now, but it's about home. I'll find it maybe, and I'll email it to you, but it's just about these different levels of if you can make yourself at home wherever you are, that says a lot about your capacity to relate to the world in a different way. And well, I will say that so I grew up in India till I was 12. Then I moved to the US. And kind of, I began my working life in New York City, working in documentaries. Um, and it became clear I was 32 or 33 that as much as I enjoyed it, that I wasn't living the life that I wanted. There was something missing. That was the first big something is missing kind of call. And when I thought about what it was, I realized that I really wanted the experience of landscape. Like I'd grown up in cities or suburbia.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking very distinctly, if I die and that's all I've known is cities and suburbs, I will really regret it. Um, so I, so that's what I got. And I managed, and it happened that I got a grant at that time when I had that insight around that time that gave me a little bit of money. I got a grant for the promise shown in one short story. And those were the things that were calling to me was like writing fiction and like travel. And I couldn't, all I knew was that I needed to go.
Mhm.
And I had Tierra del Fuego in mind because when I was young in India in a geography class, I had seen photos and this idea of the end of the world. And so it really changed my life. That was like the first big step out of I was leaving New York and going to Argentine Tierra del Fuego. So I flew to Buenos Aires and then taking this little plane to Ushuaia,
Yeah.
which is called it's the southernmost city in the world. After that, the next stop is Antarctica. All
Yeah.
the ships for Antarctica leave from there. That was wild to see them and be there. And like a lot of people in Argentina themselves have moved from the mainland to Tierra del Fuego because it's like a tax-free haven at the end of the world.
Yeah.
It's a lot of. So the overview is I was in Tierra del Fuego, then I went to Bolivia, then I went to Peru. Like these little opportunities opened up. And then I think I came back to the US and I had applied. I was actually in New Mexico. This was in 2000 and I want to say 5 or something. And I applied for this grant to go to Mongolia, which had also been on my mind
Mhm.
since I was a child. So I was like, revisiting those things that moved me as a child, places. And it was, uh, and I had to kind of come up with an idea, a project. for a grant called a Fulbright, which is a
Mhm.
grant that allows U.S. citizens to have significant encounters with cultures around the world,
Yeah.
and for as long as a year. So I ended up getting a Fulbright. So I ended up spending more or less a year and a half in Mongolia, both in the city of Ulaanbaatar,
Mhm.
where I stayed with a Mongolian family and took intensive Mongolian language classes. And then also I would go out into the countryside, the Yag Hudu, the real, like, Hudu is the countryside and Yag is like real,
So that
like out there.
that's like the steppes, right? That is what sort of what is referred to as the steppes, which is obviously where the Mongols and the Genghis Khan history and all of that. That's that area of the world, correct?
Yeah, Mongolia is the word for steppe is tal. Hudu actually means countryside.
Hmm.
So people, well, the way you say, I'm going to the countryside, people would say, I'm going to the bi hudu yavdak. I'm going to the countryside. But the word for the steppe is tal. The word for the steppe is tal. So that's where I was. Yeah, my idea was I had always wanted to have an everyday experience of that immense landscape. And so my project that I came up with was to record the sounds of everyday life in Mongolian communities. I wouldn't really say tribes because it's really communities. And but you mentioned Chinggis Khan in Mongolia. The Chinggis Khan is said that way. Chinggis, and there's a story about like how he got his name. Oh, there's a mystery about at least the way that I heard it. One is that when Chinggis Khan unified, he was born Temujin, that was his name, and when he united at that time all these different clans and fought, he named himself as like kind of the head, the emperor of them, or I don't know if it was emperor, but at that moment, a bird came and made a sound that was Chinggis, you
Wow,
know?
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. And then there's another one where there's a word in Mongolian, which it's called Dingus, which is either ocean or sky. I always get it mixed up and I forgot to double check. But in any case, it's like that because as vast as the sky or the ocean. So Chinggis Khan. And yeah, so that's where I was. I was in Mongolia for a year and a half. And that really changed my life, which I'm happy to talk more about. Like, because how it changed how I see the world, because I realized I could live in the same way that I traveled, meaning not carrying as much and being open to kind of step by step unfolding, no pun intended, but step by step unfolding of things. And that's really what led me to where I am now, uh, to New Mexico, coming back to New Mexico. Yeah. And it really opened me up to also I fell into my creativity or dove into it or working in I see myself as a writer and a performance artist, and I've also made films and I write poetry and I perform solo plays, and really traveling, especially in Mongolia, it opened me up to follow all kinds of creative possibilities. And I feel where I am now, it's really beautiful to be in New Mexico again, near this indigenous community that is called Zuni or Ashawi. And also, I've just been going through a lot of searching about what my next true step is. So that's an overview
That's,
of.
yeah, and I'd love to dig in more into a lot of that. I think it's a fascinating story, and I think it's for me what really resonates, and the Mongolia thing resonates for me in a couple of ways. I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's a documentary series called A Long Way Round, which is Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman who go around the world the long way round, like from London to New York, the long way round, and they travel. A huge part of that series is their travels through Mongolia, and I think when you look at Ewan's journey, and I believe that they ended up, him and his then wife adopted a Mongolian child off the back of that because he fell so in love with the country and of, I think, and I'd really like to hear from you. One of the perceptions I get from that and some of the other documentaries I've seen is, especially amongst the nomadic communities in Mongolia, there's a tie to the land or a tie to that is perhaps not something we kind of appreciate in the West, right? It's almost like it's part of their family or part of their being more so than kind of what we see as a more transactional piece. Though I think most indigenous communities see land differently to us that may have colonized in those indigenous spaces, coming from the British background. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how spending time with those nomadic communities kind of changed your perception of home. Obviously, growing up in big cities, and I grew up in London. I lived in Auckland for a long time. They are big, concrete, monolithic cities. Um, so it's really interested to hear your perspective of kind of how that changed your perceptions.
Yeah, I'm glad to share. Um, I just wanted to say, because you mentioned colonization, I did like the play I do that kind of changed my life. The truest thing is called The Good Manners of Colonized Subjects. And it is about the impact of the British colonization and Portuguese colonization of India in a felt body sense way, what colonization does. And I mention it because I feel without knowing it, I've been on that journey of understanding what it means to excavate the way that you're colonized inside your interior landscape. And I think that's one of the reasons land has been calling to me,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a way to be to really to be free. I think being in Mongolia, that vastness, all the immense spaces I was in, it shifted how I see the space, my interior sense of spaciousness. Like, because when you're around, so what I will say about a couple of things. Yes, I remember when I was in Mongolia, so this was 2007. Oh goodness, a long time ago. I was in Mongolia too. I want to say I'm totally blanking now. 2007, I want to say. Um, but I remember people talking about Ewan McGregor in Mongolia and saying Mongolia made him cry. Like, because because I think his bike, I forget which province he was in now. I want to say, I don't remember now. I don't know, because he may have been, I know it was like, I don't think he was in the western part of Mongolia. I want to say he was somewhere in the interior.
He was. I think
Like,
I remember right. It was very much going right through the middle almost. Because I know he stopped in Ulaanbaatar, but I don't remember because he was trying to get through to Vladivostok, I believe, to get the ferry or the boat from Vladivostok to the US.
yeah. But I remember people saying that Mongolia made him cry because I think his bike broke down.
Yeah.
They had like a big breakdown, and I also heard about him adopting somebody. Well, what to tell you. I went to Mongolia, like I said, Mongolia is changing. This is what I will say. This is what you will read about. Like the amount of, I think, a huge portion of the formerly nomadic community now lives in the city of Ulaanbaatar. And one of the issues that happens, because many people move, and they move, there's the city, which looks like, because Mongolia was kind of a Soviet satellite state, so there's these huge blocks of apartment buildings, that you might see, and it has that kind of look. Bless you.
Thank you. Sorry.
um and everything is written in Cyrillic, so you see all like the writing for the restaurants and stuff are in Cyrillic. So that sense of like romanticized nomadic is changing,
Yeah.
changing every day. And in the winter in Mongolia, for example, um, some people find it really hard to breathe because of the smoke from the wood fires of folks who've moved from the countryside to the city in what's called the Ger district, which is like they've set up gers, the yurts, outside on the rims of the city where they live in these communities and burning wood smoke. And so there's a side by side with the refinery that's on the other side of UB. So it's people find it in the winter. Some people can find it really hard, the air quality
Hmm.
from all the wood fires. I went to Mongolia for that reason in your mind that you say that like this. I wanted to know what it was like to have a different relationship, an everyday relationship with landscape.
Hmm.
And I lived with uh, in every season I spent in a different part of Mongolia. So I got to experience like the calving season in the province of Hinti, when like with a kind of an extended family that got together in this one place just to be together to tend, because all the animals were being born, and and to deal with it. And then they would move. And I got to move with the family uh, from the spring spot to the summer spot where like they were like, okay, it's time to move. And we packed up the gear into a truck and drove on the steppe, the Tal, and stopped and pointed and said, how about the father of the family said, how about we move there? This big Tal with a river, closer to a river. And we did move there
I think
and set up the gear again.
that to me is fascinating, obviously, because I think when you put a Western lens on land, it becomes a lot about ownership, right? That's my land, so I will build there, I will settle there, I will make that. I think the I'm trying to think of the right word, the kind of myth of the an Englishman and his castle, which is in that suburbia piece, you build your little fort and that's where you're safe and to have that, I don't know, freedom or relationship with land that says, well, that's now home. You haven't decided up front that this is where I'm going to. You know the area you're going to, but actually to say that looks like that could be home. I find that fascinating in terms of it's a completely different relationship with the concept of what home is.
Yeah, it is. And it was just like, I don't even have hardly the words for it. I have the just the to I remember the surreal. If I was just like the very my first time, my first season in the landscape, in the like one morning, like early in the morning, you would hear. I was staying in a ger with a young family, so like in the ger there would be the family I was staying with. They were called Jaga. Is was Jaga and Monju and his wife, or Monjugo and her husband Jaga, because Monjugo is who I knew, was a friend of a friend of a friend, like that. And they had these three kids. So we were in this ger, and then they had a little cot for me. So like in a circle, in the middle of the ger, there is like a stove where you cook. And in the morning to wake up, because that was the time of sounds of Jaga herding the cattle, and then the sounds of Monjigo making tea really early in the morning. But it's this tea called sutitse, which is more milk.
Mhm.
Su is milk, so it's milk with tea that you put a little bit of salt in.
It's almost
And
like, and not the same, but like more of a chai type thing than an
yeah, but
English black tea. That it's very
yeah, for
different.
sure. And it's somewhere between, maybe, because there's hardly any chai in it. It's like really milk and it has salt in it. And but yeah, it's more in that family than like a black tea, and it's very little tea. I think maybe the proportion of tea to milk is there's a lot more milk. um yeah, it just, while I was there towards the end of my time in Mongolia, I began doing interviews about like what we'll call gazarin domog. Gazar is land and domog is uh like legend or myth.
Mhm.
So the stories people had, the Gazari and Damag, but that was almost, it wasn't something that everybody knew. But I just mean, like, I just got so fascinated with that idea you said about people who take landscape to heart, that they were part of the family, that mountain, um, and the like living for so much stretches of time outdoors also really was. I in different kinds of landscapes. So Hinthi was like this yellow, classic yellow treeless steppe. That was my first. Then in the summer, I was in the north in Hovsgol, which is green, green and mountainous, just green, grassy green. I went sheep herding with a young boy named Ulana, and I made a little video about it. Just going every morning, we would take the goats and the sheep, like a small, like, I don't know, 50, 40, small. But that experience of like, I mean, of going up and down in Hovsgol, and then in the autumn I was in the Gobi Desert, and I stayed with a couple that had a small herd of camels. So I herded I got to um work, like, be a camel shield. Like, it was really interesting the way that the whole process of milking camels, separating the camels from the calves, but that experience of the Gobi, I'm saying, which is not like duney desert. There are dunes that look like sand dunes, but a lot of it is this dry kind of brush. It's like there's like intermittent bushes, and it's
More of a tundra,
red.
if my understanding is that it's like kind of almost a cold desert rather than a hot desert. If in that, like I know it can get
I
hot.
mean,
I'm showing my ignorance here, but my understanding is there's more green to it or brush to it than there is to. It's not a Sahara or a.
yeah, it's not a
It's very
Sahara. It's
different.
not a yeah. It would be like some parts of New Mexico too, in a way. Like I wouldn't say the high desert, but yeah, it's not like all sandy. There are portions that are that way, but it's not like the Sahara. No. Um, and then my last season, the winter, I spent in Bayan Olgi, which is a Kazakh, which is right on the border of Kazakhstan,
Hmm.
and that was entirely different, to a mountainous in a different way, and the food was different. And so I guess what I'm saying, Mongolia did become landscape to me, and like the everydayness of being out and about in landscape, herding, making sounds, you know, like there were sounds you made. People weren't herding with animals, like with dogs, as you made sounds to call camels and sheep and goats and cows, different sounds for different occasions. And there was a song that was sung to lambs, to put a lamb that had lost its calf and a calf that had lost its mother to nurse together. And there was a song that was sung to cement that bond. Like you sat and you sang to a ewe and a calf, a song that's like do go do go do go do go do go do go, like that.
I do think, and it's an interesting one. Obviously, growing up in England, I lived in New Zealand until I was 22, and I think we, for the most part, don't have that relationship with the land. It's not seen in that way, and I think a lot of that is it's an incredibly population dense country. England, or the UK is six. I think I'm probably out of date, but 62, 63 million people. I moved to New Zealand, which at the time was 4 million. It's now 5 million people, but actually has almost exactly the same square land area as the UK does. So actually a lot less densely populated, but also has its own indigenous population, Māori people. And I would never in any way try to become across as any kind of expert or knowledgeable in this. But what does come across from the people that I've met and know is that they do have a much more symbolic and deeper relationship with where they live and where they're from. And there's the word in Maori called whakapapa, which is that kind of where you're from, your lineage, your history, your genealogy. And I think that and a lot of that is tied to place and to home and to location. And I find that what I find really interesting, as I watch documentaries and do stuff, is that whilst every indigenous culture is incredibly different, that seems to purvey or wrong word, but that seems prevalent in almost every indigenous culture, that there is a tie to land, or that is part of their soul and their background and their ancestry, which perhaps us who have treated land as a colonizing, as someone from a colonizing country, it's always been seen as very transactional, right? It is property, it is to be owned, it is to be dominated, it is to be, you know even in the States now where I live, land is there to provide for you. It is not there to be part of you. And I think I'd love to hear, as you've kind of moved back to the States and in New Mexico and moved amongst an indigenous culture there, have you seen that similar relationship to land and home amongst the Zuni people, or is it very different to what you experienced in Mongolia?
Hmm. Um, and again, I wouldn't want to speak again for Ashwi or Zuni people. I will just speak to what you're saying. I think we're all searching for our reconnecting to to this place, to the land we walk on. And there was a phrase that you just said that I just that really resonated about, like, who we are in relationship to land, like searching for that or finding that or wanting to be that. But yes, I will say that there is in Zuni, there's a mountain that is sacred, and that is on, you'll see when you see the if you go to the Pueblo of Zuni website, that mountain, that mesa is, and I won't say the name of it because I feel it should be said by someone, but you will see a mesa that in English is called a corn mountain. And so I do, yeah. I mean, and it's different. See, in New Mexico, the kind of native populations, there's nomadic populations that were traditionally nomadic, like the Dene, say, and the Apache. And then there's what the Spanish, because New Mexico was colonized by the Spanish. It was a
Mhm.
colony of Spain. And then it became a part of the US. And there were indigenous people in New Mexico have kind of gone through two bouts of colonization, say, from the Spanish and then what you would call settler. And certainly so the but there's 19 what are called pueblos, which were mean places that are rooted here, that did not nomadic. So that connection to land is very, very strong for sure. Here, stories about the land, mountains named, holy mountains, sacred mountains, mountains you pray to. So yes, that connection to land, um I will say, I will agree that I think that is maybe one of the reasons that so many of us who didn't grow up in indigenous communities are drawn to them, the symbolically, because I think there is something we are all seeking about reconnecting to to land, because it's not about providing for us, but it's just like that symbiotic connection. I mean, I think that's what, if there is a kind of hunger that sometimes I feel to just be a tree, or it's like, that's what I want to dance now. I keep saying that. I'm trying to figure out what that means, but I find myself saying that so often that I want to more and more dance with trees, under trees, for trees, in supplication to stone and earth, and I think it's a symbol, a metaphor for a deeper hunger to simplify and reconnect. And I don't think it takes doing as I don't think it takes more doing. I think it just takes more being. you know, being, like, to be like, I can sit here and feel connected to that tree outside. Just
Mhm.
something like that.
I think I understand, and like I think it's one of the things that I've doing this podcast has kind of made me think a little bit about, but also just in notice of kind of my the way that my journey is it's very easy to feel lost or not feel like there's a home. Or and I think one of the things I talked about in a previous episode is people end up people are always searching for connection, searching for belonging, and that can kind of appear in different ways for people. It can be a very positive thing. It can be, I bond with the land. I want to dance with trees. And I don't say that in a mocking tone. It's like, that's a real positive way to feel like you're belonging. You become belonging with nature. You're belonging with the place that you're at. And I think one of the perils of modern life is that we often don't feel present, or we often aren't present. We have a 6-inch screen, 3 feet from our brains at almost all times, and we're distracted and we don't pay attention. And I can't remember the last time I watched a movie without picking up my phone and scrolling the internet at some point. We're not present, and I think that connection to land and nature is a really good way of doing it. And I think that's a really positive manifestation of it. You get negative manifestations. People join gangs, they do things because they want to fit in or be part of things. And I think that what I find really interesting about talking to people is hearing how they manifest that sense of belonging, and how it presents to them. And I think I've loved the story that you've been telling me about this. I think it's fascinating, and I think you've seen some beautiful things. And one of the things you sort of mentioned in our initial communications is thinking about what's next, right, for you, and where do you go, and what's the next stage of life for you. So I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of your thinking and what it is you think you're seeking in terms of home, or what you think that next step might look like for you.
Mm, thank you for asking that. I'm always, not always, but I'm often glad to reflect on that. I think when I think about what's next now, I want to reflect on, in really small ways, like to break into not only what makes me happy, but ways, I think I use this word a lot, to be of service, to be of, this keeps coming up a lot for me, this phrase, be of service. And I think that does happen when you get in touch with what really makes you happy. Um, that doesn't mean it's easy. Not all the things that make you happy are easy journeys. And there is, I think it was, there's a Quaker writer named Parker Palmer, and he wrote a book about, that says something like, before you tell your life what you want from it, listen to what it is asking of you.
Mm-hmm.
And he was quoting someone else too, I think, when he wrote that, maybe. But he did write this quote too, which is something like, vocation is when your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. And so I've been reflecting on that. Like, I do feel more and more at my essence, the things that I love to do is I love to create kind of these plays made of poetry and dance that are about colonizations of different kinds, both historical, emotional, cultural. I love taking people on a cathartic journey in which kind of my story can inspire their stories of finding ways to be free to be who they are and express their passion and purpose. And uh, bringing people out in nature more. I also love facilitating creativity workshops for people to write poem like things and song like things. I say it like things because I think we can be colonized by structures of things too. And especially in indigenous communities and communities of color, there can be a real sense of, if you start saying, using English to teach something, it can bring out a lot of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
because for a lot of communities, learning English was connected to trauma in some way.
Yep.
And so, like, for example, when I was doing this workshop in Zuni called Imagine Fantastic Futures, I go out of my way to, like, I don't have any kind of syllabus like thing in the beginning. Like, we just really play, because for a lot of people, there is trauma around how they were taught English, like not being able to, and then also their connection to their own language. So, like, it's very, so I really play and try to put English in its place, meaning it's a language that we use, but it doesn't ennoble you to speak it or not speak it.
Mm-hmm.
It's useful. And in that same way, I would like to put English and money in its place. That is to say, they're useful. Currency is literally ways to connect and transact because we've chosen that in the world. Um, but how to, yeah, I do feel this as I feel the next step involves my speaking up in ways that may not be loud, but are uh, still a kind of revolution. It's not loud, is not necessarily a revolution. So I feel like um, speaking up with a level of nuance, or creating with a level of nuance, or creating work that has this kind of nuance that sees, sees the, yeah. I don't have all the words for it, but it's this. There's a kind of speaking up and being present in a new way.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so much encaptured in that. There's that you can speak quietly and have a big impact. I know that Teddy Roosevelt quote is more, speak softly and carry a big stick. But it's not that. It is, you can speak quietly, and those words can carry meaning and they can carry power. And I really do believe in that. And I think one of the other things that really resonated with me, what you said there, is I think one of the things that makes us grow up too quickly and lose some of that wonder and joy is when we put structure around creativity. I think, when you have, if you look at the joy children get from drawing or from playing or putting on shows for their parents in their living rooms, and I think there's a wonder to that because it's free form and it's using their imagination and it's creativity that I don't think we do that as adults. I think when you start to learn creativity as an adult, whether that's learning art in high school or whether that's, you know, trying to learn structured poetry and putting, or, writing in a format that, might make you a successful author, a lot of that creativity and joy disappears from the work because you then put boundaries on the thing that you're working on. And I think that is, as soon as you do that, I think you're right. It can bring up trauma. It can bring up, experiences of what you went through when you used to enjoy something and then someone took the fun out of it. And I think that, to me, yes, that's on a minor level, but you make that around a generation or a people or, even a race, that you do that on scale and you've put that structure on something that people used to have joy in. And I think you look at, how people used to tell stories. It wasn't written. It was all oral history. It was all, communicated by poetry, by song, by dance, by, the storytelling. And then all of a sudden, no, you've got to write it down. It's got to go in a book. It's got to follow this structure. You need to have the dates and the times. And I think that what you said there about helping people connect to it in the way that you are, I think is incredibly powerful and really meaningful. And I really like that.
Thank you. I'm still working with it. It's, like I said, it is so nuanced. We're like, I will, for example, I grew up reading Enid Blyton. You might know
I
that
loved Enid
British
Blyton
writer.
books growing up, Secret Seven and Famous Five.
Yeah. All right. And it's really mixed as a person of color reading that, because when you look back at her books, all there were always these gypsies who were
Mm-hmm.
like, you would not be welcome. I mean, I actually did a radio documentary for BBC 4 called Blyton in Bombay, about the impact of Enid Blyton on generations of Indians. And it's like this mixed thing. You kind of grew up imagining the British countryside. Like, I grew up like dreaming of the moors and like heather, and like the first time I saw him, I mean, I ate a macaroon. I mean, all these things. So, but it's a kind of like you just were longing for that. I grew up reading Indian stories too, but I feel like I was kind of colonized. It was a different kind of colonization. As the British were leaving, all these stories were coming in, and they mingled with the ennobling of English that was already in our culture from the British being there for 100 years. And it kind of created another kind of reality where I grew up thinking that I was better than other Indians who spoke English badly. I grew up going to elocution classes, things like this, right? And so Enid Blyton is real mixed. And I will say, she had a series of books called The Magic Faraway Tree,
Mm-hmm.
where a group of these city kids move to the countryside and in down in the woods find a tree that is full of elves and pixies and all kinds of a different land that was in the top of the tree. You would climb up a ladder, and there was a different land that swung into place, and all of this. Now, that mixed with the myths I read, these comic book illustrations of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, were like my creativity. Were like these places of deep escape and nourishment for me as a child in a city
Mm-hmm.
who wanted who for various reasons needed to like live in her imagination. And so it's so nuanced, the ways that our encounter with each other and other cultures and what we value shape us. And so I think that to unpack that, it requires, it not requires, but it invites us to be free to explore.
Yeah.
And I'm real proponent of feeling free, I think you do need to, like, you do need, it helps to know how to build things. Like if you're going to build a house, you need to know how things work.
Yeah.
This is for making things straight, and this is for structure. So all the structures we've created about how you write this and how you write that are useful, as again, as long as you put them in your place, that they're useful to you, as opposed to they're the only way you can do it. They are of use to you. You choose, this is useful and this is useful. I choose this and I choose that because it's useful for the thing I want to build, the me that in the meanness of me,
Yeah.
So
I think that's perfect. I think when you look at it that way, is it's you. I think the way you said it a couple of times there is they are tools, and tools are there to be used, and they can be used in many different ways. A hammer isn't just about hammering nails into a wood board, right? You can use it for a number of ways. You can use it. So every carpenter that might listen to this might be yelling at me saying, "No, you should only use it in a certain way." But I think you've really kind of, to not pun, somewhat intended, hit the nail on the head with that in terms of these things are useful. And the last sort of note on that, just on something you said around that romanticization of the English countryside, and I think that in that era, that was kind of what we did. And if you look at it now, it's probably the romanticization of Hollywood or California or the beaches, and media, the way we consume things portrays things into this. Well, this is what it's like, and this is the perfect world, and I need to fit that. And I think understanding that there's freedom in not following that exact path and using your imagination to determine what is really powerful. And I think what you're doing with teaching creativity and getting outside of that is awesome. And I don't, awesome's a bit of a cliche word, but there's power in it, and I think that's really fascinating. Um, I want to say thank you for being our guest today. I've really, really enjoyed our conversation. Really fascinating, and you've got a fantastic story. So thank you so much for coming on, Shebana. I really do appreciate it.
thank you. It's been great. I really appreciate this opportunity to kind of reflect deeply on, journey and where we are and where we want to go and how we connect to each other. I think we're all in this together, and I think um, it's wonderful to connect like this.
Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to this episode of Wherever I Lay My Hat. It's very, very much appreciated. I love hearing comments from you and the feedback that we get. Again, if you'd like to be part of the show and you've got a story you'd like to tell, please reach out to dan@whereverIlayMyhat.com. And as usual, if you could like, subscribe, leave a review, leave a comment, that really helps the show grow and gets us more interesting people like Shebana to come on and tell their wonderful stories. So again, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.